My name is Emma and I have a story to tell, a story that might shock some of you and perhaps even make others question my decisions. But this is my truth, it's one I've kept hidden for so long and I've finally decided it's time to come clean. I need to start by saying that no, this isn't some wild tale of outrageous behavior or explicit scandal. This is about love, loneliness, and how a simple connection went terribly wrong. Let me take you back to the start. My husband Lucas and I have been married for almost a decade. We met when we were both fresh out of college. He was ambitious, charming, and the kind of man who could walk into any room and have everyone's attention in an instant. I fell hard for him, and the early days of our relationship were like something out of a romantic movie. It was perfect. Fast forward a few years, and life wasn't so picture perfect anymore. Richard's work took him away from home more often than not. His job was demanding, and he was constantly traveling for business meetings, conferences, and networking events. While I understood that his work was important, the absence took a toll on our marriage. We grew distant, barely talking for days at a time, and when we did talk, it was mostly surface-level conversation, the usual "how was your day" and "what's for dinner" kind of stuff. But underneath it all, I was lonely. I was craving attention, companionship, and someone to fill the void Lucas had unknowingly left in my life. That's when things started to change. We lived on a quiet, peaceful farm outside the city. One of the things that had drawn us to this place was the space and the opportunity to keep animals. We had a few chickens, a couple of goats, and of course, our horse, Midnight. Midnight was a beautiful, strong black stallion with a temperament so gentle that it felt like he understood emotions better than most people. I had always loved horses, and Midnight was special. He had been a gift from Lucas for our 5th wedding anniversary, a gesture to show how much he cared, even though he couldn't always be there during the long, lonely days when Lucas was away. Midnight became my source of comfort. I would spend hours in the stable, brushing him, talking to him, and just being in his presence. It sounds strange, I know, but animals have a way of sensing when you're hurting. Midnight always seemed to know when I was sad or frustrated, and he would nudge me gently with his nose as if to say, "I'm here, you're not alone." Over time, those moments with Midnight became the highlight of my days. I found myself pouring my heart out to him, telling him things I couldn't even tell my husband. Midnight was patient, never judgmental, and always there. It was as if he had become the emotional support I had been missing. I know what you're thinking, how could I compare a horse to my husband? But you have to understand that Lucas was absent, and Midnight was all I had. The turning point came one summer evening. Lucas was out of town as usual, and I was feeling particularly down. I had just gotten off a call with him, and once again, it felt like we were two strangers living separate lives. I walked out to the stable, hoping to find some peace with Midnight. As I brushed his coat, I started talking to him like I always did, but this time, something was different. I was venting about my frustrations, my loneliness, and how disconnected I felt from Richard. I was rambling on, not even thinking about what I was saying, when suddenly I realized that I was speaking about Midnight in a way that made my heart race. I caught myself, shook my head, and laughed it off. "Emma, you're being ridiculous," I told myself. Midnight was a horse, a magnificent one, yes, but still just a horse. I tried to brush off the strange thoughts that had begun to creep into my mind, but as the days went on, I found myself returning to the stable more and more often, lingering longer than I should have, and feeling a growing sense of attachment to Midnight that I couldn't explain. I felt guilty. How could I be so emotionally invested in an animal when I had a husband? But the more I tried to push it away, the stronger the connection became. Midnight was always there, and Richard, well, Lucas wasn't. The truth is, I wasn't cheating in the way you might expect. There was no physical betrayal, no affair in the conventional sense, but emotionally, I had crossed a line. I had started to confide in Midnight in ways that should have been reserved for my husband. Then one evening, everything came crashing down. Lucas came home unexpectedly from one of his trips. I didn't hear him pull into the driveway, and I was in the stable as usual with Midnight. I didn't realize how much time I had spent there, how absorbed I had become in this strange emotional attachment. When Lucas walked into the stable, he found me standing next to Midnight, whispering softly to him. I didn't notice Lucas until it was too late. "What are you doing?" Richard's voice was sharp, filled with confusion and suspicion. His eyes darted between me and Midnight as if trying to piece together the scene in front of him. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to say. How could I explain this without sounding insane? Lucas stood there, staring at me, waiting for an explanation that I wasn't sure how to give. How could I even begin to explain the emotional whirlwind I had been caught in? The silence in the stable felt like it was stretching on forever, broken only by the soft snorts of Midnight, who was completely unaware of the storm that had just blown in. "Emma, what the hell is going on?" Lucas asked again, his voice a mix of confusion and anger. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as if he was trying to understand what he was seeing. I stepped back, instinctively putting a hand on Midnight's side as if he could somehow shield me from the confrontation that was coming. "It's not what you think, Richard," I stammered, though I wasn't even sure what he thought yet. How could he explain what he was witnessing when I barely understood it myself? He shook his head, clearly not convinced. "Then tell me, because I come home early and I find you here whispering to our horse like he's. I don't even know what I'm supposed to think." I took a deep breath, trying to find the words to explain the emotional connection I had developed with Midnight without sounding completely insane. "Richard, you've been gone a lot lately," I started, and I could already see the frustration building in his eyes. "I know it's your job, and I know you're working hard for us, but I've been lonely, and Midnight, he's been here for me. He's listened when I didn't have anyone else." He threw his hands up in exasperation. "He's a horse, Emma. You're talking like he's a person." I winced at his words, but couldn't deny that he was right. "I know," I whispered, "but he was there when you weren't. I started to talk to him because I didn't have anyone else. It got out of hand," I continued. Lucas looked at me, his expression a mix of disbelief and hurt. "So what you're saying is you had an emotional affair with a horse?" The words sounded absurd even to me, but the reality of the situation wasn't as far-fetched as it seemed. "I didn't mean for it to happen," I said quietly, tears welling up in my eyes. "I was just so lonely, Richard. I needed someone to talk to, and Midnight was there." He shook his head again, clearly struggling to process everything. "So what are you telling me, that you love him, that you'd rather be with him than me?" His voice cracked slightly, and I could tell that, beneath the anger, there was a deep sense of betrayal. "No, of course not," I replied quickly, stepping forward and reaching for his hand. "I love you, Richard, but I was lonely, and I made a mistake. I let my emotions get the better of me, and I turned to Midnight when I should have turned to you." He pulled his hand away, pacing back and forth in the small stable. "This is insane. I don't even know how to wrap my head around this. I come home and this is what I find, my wife confessing some kind of emotional affair with our horse." I stood there helplessly, unsure of how to fix the situation. "Richard, please, it wasn't like that. I didn't do anything physical, nothing inappropriate. I got lost in the loneliness for a moment." He didn't say anything, he just stood there, his back turned to me as he tried to collect his thoughts. Then finally, he spoke. "Do you know how crazy this sounds, Emma? How ridiculous this whole situation is?" I nodded, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know, but it's the truth. I let my loneliness cloud my judgment, and I'm sorry. I never meant for it to get this far." Lucas turned to face me, his expression softening slightly. "Why didn't you talk to me? Why didn't you tell me you were feeling this way?" "I tried," I said, my voice trembling. "But every time I brought it up, you were too busy, or too tired, or just distracted. I gave up. I thought maybe this was just how things were going to be, so I found comfort in Midnight. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but he was there for me in a way you weren't." He sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't know you felt this way. I thought we were fine." We weren't, I replied softly. But I didn't want to burden you with it. You were always so busy with work, and I didn't want to seem needy. But the truth is, I needed you, Richard. I needed my husband, and when you weren't there, I turned to midnight. There was a long silence between us as we both stood there, the weight of the situation sinking in. Finally, Lucas spoke again, his voice much softer this time. I don't know what to do with this, Emma. I don't know how to move forward from here. I took a deep breath, feeling the tears spill over onto my cheeks. I don't either, I admitted, but I want to fix this. I want to fix us. I love you, and I don't want to lose you. Lucas looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and uncertainty. I love you too, Emma, but this is going to take time. I nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. I know, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right. He sighed again, finally stepping closer to me. We need to talk about this. Really talk about everything, not just midnight, but us, where we went wrong, and how we can fix it. I nodded, reaching out to take his hand again, this time feeling him squeeze it back. I'm ready to talk, Richard. I'm ready to make things right. As we stood there in the stable, the air thick with the weight of our conversation, I realized that this was the first step in rebuilding what had been broken. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. And with that, Emma and Lucas began the long process of healing their marriage, learning to reconnect, and rediscovering the love that had once brought them together.